One of the most important characters in The Godfather is this guy. Early in the second film, we see the emergence of the powerful Jewish gangster Hyman Roth. What appeared to be a business deal between him and Michael soon turned to a cat-and-mouse game between two of the most powerful mobsters at the time. But what if I told you Hyman Roth was based on a real-life mobster who was bigger and more powerful in real life? Enter this man, Meyer Lansky. Meyer was a Jewish mobster loosely based on Roth, with many comparisons between the film and real life. From his statement about being bigger than U.S. Steel to him fleeing at the end of the film, there are many real-life comparisons to Meyer Lansky. Meyer was a very mysterious figure within organized crime, and we will need to take a deep dive into his past. Let's dive into who the real-life Hyman Roth really was. If you didn't know who he was, you'd think he was an executive of an American corporation, said an FBI agent. Known as the mob's accountant, Meyer was sharp and great with numbers, being one of the masterminds behind the mafia in New York. Lansky landed in New York at the age of 8 in the year 1911. After fleeing from anti-Semitism in his old country Russia, he and his family looked to start a new life in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The family struggled when Meyer was growing up, barely having enough to scrape by. One thing that caught his eye when he was growing up was the dice games people would play on the corner, and one day, as he was going to get dinner for the family, he decided to partake in a craps game. Determined to win, he placed his bet, but unfortunately he lost the bet. For the next week, his family would have to get by only eating bread and water. Meyer was dejected and vowed he would become a winner. This would be a defining moment for Meyer. He continued to study how the craps game worked, and one day, he decided to give the game another go. But this time, it was different. He had won. The ecstatic youngster continued to play the game all over the city and won, providing a glimpse of hope for the kid. One day when Meyer was walking home from school, he saw a street craps game break out into a fight. He went over to see what was going on, and to his surprise, one of the teenagers drew a gun. Just as police whistles blew, Meyer grabbed the kid's arm, forcing him to drop the gun. This kid's name was Benjamin Siegel, or Bugsy as people called him. The two formed a friendship that would last for decades. And not long after this incident, the two formed what was called the Bugs and Meyer Gang. The pair began getting involved in numerous small crimes like car theft, hijackings, and gambling. The crew soon gained a notorious reputation within their town. This was around the time Meyer would meet his most important connection, Charles Luciano. Walking home from school, Meyer was set upon by a Sicilian gang trying to shake him down. The leader, Luciano, demanded he pay him protection money. Instead, Meyer told him to go screw himself. Though small, standing at 5'4", Meyer was tough and brave. Luciano respected what he heard from Lansky and let him go without robbing him. The Bugs and Meyer mob continued to run their petty crimes until something happened, something that would change their lives. In 1920, the selling of alcohol became illegal. And for some, this was just another law, but Meyer saw an opportunity. He knew alcohol could be transported into New York illegally, but there was a problem. He needed partners. Enter Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, who was known as the Brain, was the kingpin of New York at the time, running illegal bookmaking and gambling businesses. Rothstein knew very well about this opportunity and needed a couple of up-and-coming hustlers. He looked no further than Meyer Lansky and Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The two helped run Rothstein's operation. He and Lucky would import and distribute scotch and whiskey to buyers and soon began running what Lansky said was the most efficient shipping business in the world. They made a fortune running these loopholes, but there were some issues along the way. In 1928, Rothstein lost a bet playing cards and refused to pay, thinking the game was fixed. This led to the perpetrators whacking him, leaving Meyer and his counterparts without a steady supply of liquor, and with Prohibition likely to be uplifted soon, Meyer was going to need a new supply of cash. Shortly after this, Meyer and many other underworld enforcers devised a meeting to discuss current and future situations. Mobsters like Al Capone, Charles Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, and many more attended this conference in Atlantic City, and they discussed various topics. Stopping senseless fighting, maximizing profits, and considering the possible end of Prohibition were all discussed at this meeting. This gave Lansky new insights on how to amass flows of profit. Lansky had been running gambling games on the side until another unexpected event would happen. His good friend Charles Luciano found himself in the middle of a La Cosa Nostra mafia war, and he needed Meyer's help. It would be Meyer's Jewish gangsters who aided Luciano to victory in the war. When Luciano's main enemy, Salvatore Maranzano, ordered him to his office, he knew this was a death sentence. Instead, Charles sent 4 of Meyer's men posing as government officials to whack Maranzano, effectively ending the war. With this, Luciano reached the pinnacle of the mafia, and Meyer was his close alliance. Although Lansky could never be initiated within the Mafia since you had to be full-blooded Italian to become a ranking member, he formed many strong relationships with many willing to aid him when he needed. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Meyer turned back to what he first started with, gambling. He would open a casino in Saratoga Springs with the protection of the Mafia while also paying off law enforcement. When this began to rake in a large amount of money, Lansky expanded his casinos to Florida, building a string of these operations in Hallandale. He would continue to run these schemes, skimming from the earnings of these casinos. Meyer understood that these gambling games didn't have to be rigged, and knew that in the end, the odds always favored the house. And after gaining notoriety for these successful operations, he received an offer he couldn't refuse. Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista saw his casinos were not very profitable, and they had a reputation for being rigged. Needing an intervention, he hosted what was called the Havana Meeting in 1946. Like the film portrayed, many mobsters met to discuss business opportunities in Cuba. Batista designated Lansky to fix up the crooked gambling games, and by the 1950s built and ran a casino called the Riviera Hotel. This huge 21-story hotel became an instant cash cow for Meyer and attracted many people to indulge at his casino. But shortly after the Riviera was opened, a new power emerged in Cuba named Fidel Castro, and by 1959 rebels had stormed and looted businesses, including his hotel. All Meyer could do was watch. He poured in an estimated $15 million into the hotel, and now it was no more. By the time he came back to the States, there was heavy surveillance around the mob, and law enforcement traced him to be one of the founding fathers of organized crime. This resulted in him being under constant surveillance by police. Wiretaps were placed all around his house and any hotel he stayed in. This would make it hard for Meyer to continue any of his rackets, and found himself in an uncertain situation, especially after the Havana disaster. It seemed as though Lansky had been retired, considering nothing was found on the tapes that incriminated him compared to his peers. Except for one thing. While Meyer was watching TV, the panelists stated organized crime was only second in size to the government. This is when Lansky said that organized crime was bigger than U.S. Steel. After feeling as though he was being targeted, Meyer moved to Israel in 1970 and hoped to get his residency. But his residency was declined after the Prime Minister found out he was part of the Mafia. From here, he tried to move to Paraguay, but they declined him as well. His only other option was Miami. When he arrived back in the U.S., he was immediately arrested after a case was built, after a former Mafia-turned-informant spilled the tea. The informant, Fat Vinny, claims he gave Lansky skimming money from one of his illegally run casinos in London. Meyer was facing tax evasion charges, but when trial came, it was found that Fat Vinny lied and Lansky was acquitted. He claimed he was a modest retired investor living on a pension. He would go on to live in retirement for the next 10 years until he died of cancer in 1983. Though the FBI believed he had a secret stash of wealth worth $300 million, this wasn't the case. Lansky only left behind $57,000 for his family compared to the claimed $300 million. It seems as though his blunder in Cuba, along with the 24/7 surveillance from the cops and the legal battles, wiped him clean. As we uncovered, there were many similarities from the character Hyman Roth. From the mention of bootlegging, his modest living, and even the mention of U.S. Steel, there was definitely inspiration from real life. Even the deal between Michael and Hyman was centered around the real-life meeting in Havana, Cuba regarding the hotels. On the surface, the film seems to be a fictional tale, but in reality there's hints of real-life events sprinkled in.